Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Holland Lifelong Learning here at the South Carolina Aquarium, where we explore local issues and conservation research and science with local experts. Thank you for joining us virtually and in person, both here. And I would like to thank our sponsors for the evening, Mary and Mason Holland and Chris Cocker from Ameriprise Financial. Now, when you think of animals at the beach, most likely you're thinking of crabs, sea turtles, shorebirds, and even the fish you might have on your dinner plate. The main mammals that come to mind for me are bottlenose dolphins and those summer migrations of scantily clad Homo sapiens, also tourists. The animals that don't come to mind and are not often documented in our beachcombers books are the North American bobcat, scientific name Lynx rufus. Now, here to help us understand the bobcat's role and their link in the food chain is Jim Jordan. Jim Jordan is a South Carolina native, born and raised in Columbia. He received a bachelor's degree in biology from Furman University and a Master of Science in Wildlife Ecology and Management from the University of Georgia. Jim is a wildlife biologist for the town of Kiawah, and he has worked there for the last 21 years. Jim's work at Kiawah involves wildlife and beach management, invasive plant control, wildlife population surveys, community outreach, like tonight, and wildlife research. Some of his research projects focus on white-tailed deer ecology and fawn survival, songbird migration and banding, alligator physiology and behavior, and of course, bobcat ecology and habitat use. Please help me in welcoming Jim Jordan.
All right, thank y'all so much for having me. Oh, let me get a little back here. All right, thank y'all so much for having me tonight. What a great place to give a talk, right? It's I've given a lot of talks over the years, and this is one of the neatest places to do it. So we'll just jump right into it. I'm sure most of you are probably from the area and know where Kiawah is, but in case you don't, it's located about 20 miles southwest of downtown Charleston here. So Kiawah is right here, a long and skinny island in between Seabrook and Folly. And so a little more about Kiawah itself, the development. So it's a gated residential resort community, about 8,000 total acres. If you take away the marsh and the water, that's about 5,000 upland acres. We've got 5 golf courses, a little over 700 permanent residents. We've got over 3,000 developed lots and a grand total of around 4,400 residential properties. So just a little bit about the type of research that we do at the town. So what we tend to do is we focus on 2 different types of species. The first are what we call keystone species. So these are species that are vital for ecosystem health. In a lot of cases, they can actually alter the habitat in which they live. So great examples are obviously the bobcat, which we're gonna spend most of our time on here tonight. But alligators are also, kind of serve that role in the ecosystem. They sit at the top of the food chain as well. White-tailed deer are one you might not think of as a keystone species, but they can alter the environment in which they live by the types of things that they eat. So if they heavily browse an area, they can basically, let's say eat all the oak saplings in an area. And so over time, your oak forest goes away and it transitions to something else. The other group of species we like to focus on are what we call indicator species. Probably a term you've heard before. It's basically a species that's a really good indicator for typically a certain habitat type. So examples of those that we study on the island would be migratory songbirds. And we focus on songbirds that breed to the north and winter either here or to the south, because Kiawah provides really critical habitat for them during migration. We also study marsh sparrows, which live in the tidal salt marsh. They're a great indicator for the health of the salt marsh, and also likely a good indicator for future impacts from sea level Painted buntings are a local favorite. They breed here. They breed in the scrub shrub dense understory of the maritime forest along the coast. And then last is Wilson's plovers, which are a nesting species on our beaches. So all of those kind of help us kind of keep tabs on all the different habitat types. But we came here to talk about bobcats, so let's jump into that. So bobcats are about twice the size of a domestic cat. Males typically weigh between 12 and 68 pounds. A 68 pounder would be from, up near Canada or Maine up there. Down here, 20 to 28. Our females are 14 to 20. Bobcats breed in the late winter, early spring, February through April. Kittens are born about 2 months later. They typically have 1 to 3, but we found up to 5 in dens on Kiawah before. They're a solitary animal, so they're not together very often. So if you see more than one bobcat at a time, it's either a male and a female pair during breeding, which is a very brief encounter, or it's a female with kittens. So the kittens will stay with the female for about a year until the next breeding season. They are a visual predator, so they don't have a very good sense of smell. They've got great eyesight, and obviously they're very quick and agile. So they tend to stalk through cover or lay in ambush and wait for a prey species to come by. So here in South Carolina, they're going to feed primarily on rodents, rabbits, birds, and deer. And we'll talk a little bit about their impact on the deer population here in a minute. So just a little bit more about bobcats on Kiawah in particular. It's a very well-researched population. We've been doing research with bobcats for 21 years. We know that their historic population on the island was 30 to 35. We know specifically from looking at their food habits by analyzing scat that their primary prey is rodents, but they do key in on deer fawns during the spring. And then they seem to key in on birds as well during the winter months. Their average home range size varies, but adult males, it's around 1,500 acres, and females are about half that at 800 acres. On Kiawah, they're an iconic species, so our residents love them. They really help drive our conservation efforts. They're almost kind of the unofficial mascot of the island. So we'll get into the research itself. The first time we started using GPS collars on bobcats was in 2007, and we've done it every year since then. So this is the longest continuous study on bobcats using GPS collars in the entire world. We trap every winter, typically January through March. To date, we've captured and collared 92 bobcats, 52 females and 40 males. And so these GPS collars are, they're tracking the movements of these bobcats in the wild. They typically collect a location every 4 hours, and then that data comes back to us via the satellite network system. And so what do we do with all these points? Well, we analyze it and we look at a variety of things, and we're going to go over some of that here real briefly. And so we'll get started. I guess before we get to that, let's talk about how do you catch a bobcat, because that's a question I get quite a bit. We've tried a number of techniques over the years, but the one that is most effective for us is to use a little bantam rooster. And so he's in his own separate compartment in the back, right here. Bobcat cannot get to him. We've never had a rooster killed by a bobcat, and we've caught close to 200 different bobcats over the years. So once we've got them in the trap, obviously we're going to immobilize them. We're going to take them out. We're going to weigh them, sex them, age them if we can. And then we'll put a GPS collar on them, and then we'll set them back in the trap and wait for them to wake up from the immobilization. And then we get to let them go, which is one of my favorite parts. So I've tried that with my iPhone probably 150 times. It's worked twice. Here's the other one. This was my favorite, I think. You think you know where they're going to run, and they always turn at the last minute. All right, so we'll spend just a little bit of time on habitat use, kind of how we analyze the location data, and kind of a variety of different things that we use to better help understand bobcats and better manage them on the island. So one thing we do with our points is we'll break them down into habitat types. So where do these bobcats spend the majority of their time? So at Kiawah, these are just daytime points. And so you can clearly see that this scrub shrub habitat is of critical importance to bobcats during the day. Now, scrub shrub is typically found in the secondary dunes or along the tidal salt marsh. So it's low scrubby areas, either, as I said, the interface between the tidal salt marsh and the uplands, or the area between the open primary dunes and the forest itself. Secondary or tertiary dunes, they tend to be filled with yopon holly, tiny live oaks, very, very dense cover. And these cats really utilize that during the day. At night, it gets a little bit different. Scrub shrub is still pretty important, but forest and developed areas become a little more important at night. And we'll look at data from one female in particular, and you'll kind of be able to see that big difference between day and night. And so this is an adult female bobcat. For those of you familiar with Kiawah, this is the second security gate right here. This would be Governor's Drive, and then this is Flyway Drive and Surfside. And so we're going to start out and we'll look at her daytime points. So this is all of her daytime points for a month. And right, no surprise, as I said, that scrub shrub habitat along the beach is really important. And you've got a few points up here next to the tidal salt marsh. And so if you zoom in on one of those clusters in particular, obviously she's hiding out in dense cover during the day, no surprise. I guess what might be a little surprising is that she's doing it right next to multi-million-dollar beachfront properties, right? And a lot of times she's actually underneath these boardwalks that people are actually walking to the beach on and probably have no idea that she's hiding underneath. So now we're going to jump back. I'll show you daytime points again, and then I'm going to put nighttime points up. So pretty big difference, right? So at night, she's roaming her entire home range, and she's utilizing developed properties, which are indicated in purple here. So she's hunting in backyards and next to homes, buffer strips. And we can also see kind of some interesting travel corridors she seems to prefer. This is one example along Flyway Drive where you've got a wooded buffer that runs the entire way basically from the beach to the marsh. And so she uses that on a regular basis. And so another thing that we do when we've got this data is we'll determine the home range size of each of our cats. And then we'll break that down even further and look at what we call core home ranges. And so these tell us the areas within their home range that are really, really important to that individual bobcat. And so all of these things I'm talking about, including the next few, will kind of tell you how we weave all this data together, again, to come up with a management plan for these bobcats. So obviously, you can't have a healthy bobcat population without kittens and successful reproduction. So knowing where our female bobcats are denning and how successful they are is critically important. They typically tend to den in undeveloped areas away from people. So we have had them den underneath homes before. I actually had one time that was basically on a second story, an elevated deck next to a hot tub. And we could not get to the kittens, but we could hear them while we were inside the house standing next to the hot tub. Luckily, they ended up moving them and we were able to find them in a different location. So they certainly do take advantage of houses and that sort of thing, but they prefer to be in a pretty undeveloped, larger area. They don't create a den, actually. They don't dig out anything or make a hole. They simply pick a good spot. It might be under a palm frond or just in a thicket of briars. And typically, the female will move her den site a couple of times in the first 2 months. And then here's a couple of kittens. These are about 3 weeks old. You can hear the crows going crazy in the background as well. And so when we find these dens, we are taking the kittens out very, very briefly. Each kitten gets a pit tag. So just like your dog or cat, if you take it to the vet to be microchipped, that's what we do to these kittens. We take them out, take a few pictures, pit tag them, and they're back in the den within a minute. We've never had a female abandon the den. That's just not something that wild animals do. And then so I talked about, the importance of knowing where these dens are so that we can learn things about, areas on the island we need to protect. So this slide shows all the bobcat dens we found over the years. And so obviously there's a couple of spots on the island that are really, really important for bobcat denning. And so obviously these are areas we're going to focus, either preservation efforts or, conservation or management efforts to try to maintain those areas. All right, and so we've talked about kind of how we analyze the data, and so then what do we do with it? How do we put it into practice? And so we've developed a document called our Bobcat Management Guidelines. And basically what we've done is divided the island up into 5 management units, and each of those is about the size of the home range of a bobcat. And so then we delve further into those bobcat management units, and again, using all the data I just talked about, we pick out certain pieces of property or parcels that are really, really important for bobcats. And we call them IBAs. And then we develop an action plan to address each of those IBAs. So we figure out who owns it, what condition is it in, what are potential future plans for it, all of this to try to better protect bobcats and help them survive on the island. And then just a real quick summary from that GPS data. So bobcats spend the majority of their daylight hours in patches of thick cover, right? Typically that's the secondary dunes or on the salt marsh. And then at night, they can be pretty much anywhere. They'll travel through developed areas, along road corridors and buffer strips, taking advantage of all parts of the island. One thing we've noticed is they avoid golf courses. So we almost never get a bobcat location on a golf course, which is no surprise. There's no food out there for them and there's nowhere for them to hide. So things were going great, right? We've got the longest continuous bobcat study in the world. Our residents love our bobcats. The population is healthy, doing great. And then something happens. And I'm sure a lot of you, there was a good bit of media publicity on this over the last year or two. So you may be aware, but in 2007, we started to see our bobcat population decline. The survival rate of our collared bobcats, historically going way back, was greater than 90%. So greater than 90% of our bobcats lived for the entire year that we had a collar on them. Beginning in 2017, our survival rate started dropping. It got as low as 25%. So in some years we were losing 75% of our collared bobcats. And for a while we didn't know what was going on. The other thing we noticed was that even our females that weren't dying, they were not producing kittens. And so we knew our numbers were crashing pretty quickly. And another strong confirmation of that is that our deer numbers went through the roof. So we'll talk about that real quick. We did a study back in 02 to 05 where we were catching deer fawns the day they were born. We were putting little tiny radio collars on them. And we would track them for up to a year, depending on how long they lived. And at that point, we were trying to figure out, how big is the influence of bobcats on our deer population? And what we found was that it's incredibly substantial. So out of the 124 deer fawns that we put collars on, bobcats killed 56% of them. And they killed almost all of them in their first 2 weeks of life. So that's bobcats, doing what they're supposed to be doing, right? They're a top predator. Their job is to control populations of prey species, which they had been doing with our deer population for many years. And so we did a small fertility control study back in the early 2000s, which did drop our deer numbers a little. But you can see that from 02 to about 2016, 2017, our deer population was stable. You're always going to get some fluctuation when you're doing a survey of a wild population. But for all practical purposes, our numbers were stable. And then beginning in 2017, obviously our numbers have gone through the roof. We've completed one survey in 2021 so far, and I haven't added it yet because we'll do another one and average those. But that survey came in at about 140. So we're still going up. So why? Well, it took us a while to figure it out. But there's likely some other things going on with increased development and things like that. But that would be, you would see a very slow decline as habitat was reduced or that sort of thing. A steep decline like this is from an acute cause, so something that's happening very quickly on these animals. And so what we figured out is that anticoagulant rodenticides were having a very detrimental impact on our bobcat population. So for those of you not familiar with an anticoagulant, it's a type of poison used to control rats and mice around homes and commercial areas. Just briefly on how it works, it inhibits the body's recycling of vitamin K. So basically it causes the rat or mouse to basically bleed to death, typically over the course of 3 to 7 days. There are two types of these anticoagulants. The first generation anticoagulants have been around for a long, long time. Brand names like Decon, for example, warfarin. Warfarin is a type of first generation anticoagulant. It's also a medicine often prescribed by doctors. And so they had very, while they were still potentially toxic to secondarily to other things that consume the rat or mouse, they were much, much less toxic than the second generation ones, which were developed about 20 or 30 years ago. So these new anticoagulants, they work the same way. They inhibit vitamin K. They cause the animal to bleed to death, but they're effective in a single dose. And these are the chemical names of the 4 SGAs that are currently in use, but they last an incredibly long time in the environment. And so, as I said, they're lethal to rodents in a single feeding, many times more toxic than the first generation ones. They don't kill immediately. Like I said, it takes 3 to 7 days for the rat or mouse to die. And during that time, they're out in the environment. And they're much, much more likely for a bobcat or bird of prey or anything to catch them. And so every time a predator eats one of these rats or mice that has these anticoagulants, they pick up a little bit of it, right? It's just like, the bioaccumulation of mercury, in king mackerel or other species of fish. And so, when we first kind of figured out this is what was going on, we started looking into the issue. And there's a lot of research on it globally, across the world. There are countless papers on the impacts of these compounds on top predators. Typically, it's large predators or birds of prey. There's very, very little research in the Southeast in particular. There's a lot of research out in California, but very little in our area. And we couldn't find any research in the state of South Carolina. So no one's looked at the direct impacts of these products in our state that we can find. And so, as I said, we know it's having impacts. So, we can see that in our bobcat numbers. We can see it in our deer population. But what are the direct impacts to cats themselves? Like, how many do we actually know that died? And so the answer is 7. So the first one was an adult female that died in August of 2019. So that was, we knew something was going on. We were trying to figure it out. We were able to get our hands on a collared bobcat that died, get her to a lab to get necropsy. And we figured out that she effectively bled to death from bioaccumulating these SGAs. And so then the second one was an adult male in May of 2020. And then the most tragic was an adult female in June of 2020. And she died during labor. And all 4 of her kittens died with her. And so obviously that really kind of brought the issue to the forefront. We knew it was an issue. We were pushing to have something done, but that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, if you will. And so we've tested a number of other bobcats over the years that have died from either a roadkill or something else, and they've all showed exposure to SGAs. So we know it's obviously very prevalent. So then another thing we've started doing is we're testing any animal, basically any animal we come across on the island that's dead, we're going to pick it up and we're going to take a sample and we're going to get it tested. So at this point, we've tested 64 different animals. 73% have showed exposure to second generation anticoagulants. So that includes 100% of our bobcats, 62% of our raccoons, 80% of our possums, and then 100% of our screech owls. Granted, that's only one. Cooper's hawk. Both of the alligators we've tested have showed exposure. We've tested one rat, and it also showed exposure. So obviously, that data tells you that these products, that they persist in the environment an incredibly long period of time, and they're picked up by just about every animal out there. So this is just a map of where we've tested animals. And so we kind of try to use this to see if we can pinpoint certain areas of the island where the use of these products is more prevalent so that we can hopefully take some action. And so, yeah, moving on to the action we've taken. So it gets a little complicated, and I won't delve too much into it. We've got another 5 or 10 minutes. But the town spent a considerable amount of time trying to figure out what to do, how to address this issue. And what we learned early on was that we couldn't pass an ordinance because state law does not allow municipalities to regulate these products in any way. They can only be regulated at the federal and state level. So that was off the table. So we developed our Bobcat Guardian program, which basically was asking, residents, businesses, pest management companies to take the pledge not to use these products. And then we promote those individuals on our website. And we've had really good success with that. We've gotten a lot of help from some other entities, including state conservation groups. And in March of 2021, the South Carolina Senate Senator Campson actually did introduce a bill to allow municipalities to regulate SGAs. It's not likely to go very far, but it's at least, it's a nice gesture. So I'm gonna spend the last probably 5 minutes just talking about where we're going next with this, and then just a few things that you as individuals can do to help. While this research is all on Kiawah, this is not a Kiawah problem. This is taking place in probably every community in the state of South Carolina, potentially every state in the U.S. All right, so we've got a new research project that's going to be kicking off this February. It's a 4-year study. It's about $1 million research project. So we've gotten a lot of funding. Some of it is coming from state agencies. Excuse me. I'm not used to talking in a mask for this long. Mouth gets dry. So a 4-year PhD study, funding from a variety of sources. And I'm just going to run over the 6 major project objectives. So the first is to kind of continue what we're doing, to continue to look at these SGA concentrations in bobcats, and to continue to look at bobcat behavior and survival. So just what we're doing using GPS collars. The second is to take a real deep dive back into all of our historic data. So we've got over 150,000 GPS locations. And so we can do a lot of pretty neat modeling of population change over time. And so this student will be looking at a lot of that using the historical data sets. We're also going to start looking again at bobcat scat samples, looking at food habits. What are bobcats eating? The hope here is that, we can figure out what their preferred rodent species is, and that may be where they're picking up a lot of these SGAs. The fourth is to continue to look at kind of the secondary part of this food chain of how these SGAs are moving up to bobcats. Certainly a lot of it is, bobcats eating rats and mice, but it's also bobcats eating, raccoons or possums or other things that are also picking it up. So we're going to continue to look at those animals. And then we're going to look at something we haven't looked at for many years, which are the rodents themselves. So figuring out, all the different species of rodents we have on Kiawah, how big their population is, which areas of the island are they, more common on. And obviously the whole point of all of this is to figure out more about this whole SGA issue and how we can deal with it. And the sixth objective is no surprise. We want to maintain and help our bobcat population recover and remain a healthy, stable bobcat population in perpetuity. And so, just kind of to summarize what we hope to come out of this research, and I won't go over all of these because I've kind of already touched on them, but we want to, better understand the impacts of these rodenticides on all the wildlife out there. We want to also work on developing best practices for controlling rodents in these sensitive areas, sensitive developments, to minimize impacts to wildlife, sustain our bobcat population, as I said, come up with ways to reduce rodent populations in developments, because it is an issue. Certainly in commercial areas, restaurants in particular, there need to be mechanisms to control rodent populations. You can't just say don't do anything. You just got to come up with, greener, smarter ways to do it. And then we want to serve as a model for, how people and animals can live together in developed areas without impacting each other. Dude, froze up on me. Oh, let's try it now. Oh, it just got bumped a little bit. All right, my last slide. So how can you help? So if you live on Kiawah or you live anywhere, protecting and preserving vital bobcat habitat is important. We touched on where that is. At least on Kiawah, right? It's this dense understory that's native plants. So, even if you don't live on Kiawah, the more native plants you can have in your yard, the better. And the more dense understory you can have is also great for things like painted buntings as well as bobcats. And so that's one of another town initiative we call our Grow Native initiative. And that's trying to get more native plants into backyards on the island. For rodent control itself, there's the right way to do it and the wrong way to do it. What we tell people is, make sure you have a rodent problem before you do anything. If you do, take corrective action. So that's typically going to be using traps or something like that initially. Rodenticide should only be used in the absolute last resort. And if they are used, it should be for a very short period of time, and then they should be removed. And there are plenty of alternative rodenticides that are not anticoagulants and work just as well. So there's never a reason to use a second generation anticoagulant. And if you live on Kiawah or if you don't live on Kiawah, become a bobcat guardian. Take the pledge not to use these products. They obviously do, very substantial harm to our ecosystem. And with that, I will take questions.
Thank you, Jim, for giving us a little insight on these elusive bobcats and these beach animals that we don't typically think of. I do want to open it up to questions for our in-person audience and our virtual audience. So you have a hand over here.
We're residents of Sullivan's Island, and we have a terrible time with our coyotes over there. I noticed on your slides, you showed a coyote in the middle, but you showed it as a bobcat prey, I believe. How significant have they been in controlling your bobcat, controlling your coyote population?
Yeah, so coyotes kind of have an interesting story on Kiawah. So we saw our first coyote on Kiawah in about 2012. So that's when they first arrived. For the next 2 years, they became fairly common. Our residents were seeing them quite a bit. They were all across the island and in very, very high numbers. in about 2015, their numbers started to decline as the population kind of evened out and stabilized. Typically, when a predator, a coyote, for example, moves into an area, we call it the colonization phase. So there are a bunch of coyotes coming into the area, and they're trying to figure out who's going to set up a territory and live in that space. And so during that colonization phase, coyotes are kind of everywhere. And then once they set up territories, they actively defend them. And so your numbers tend to decline. So we basically leveled out with numbers. But since 2017, well, up until this year, we hadn't seen a coyote in 3.5 years.
Wow.
So, and I can tell you most likely why. And that's because they were dying from the same thing that these bobcats are dying from. So we know from research out in California that coyotes and canines are about 40 times more likely to die from building up these SGAs in their system. Bobcats and other felines are incredibly resistant to the secondary impacts of these products. So it was, early on in this, we reached out to the California folks because they've been doing research with SGAs for 25 years, and they were incredibly surprised to see bobcats dying directly from this. They hadn't seen it in 25 years of research. What they see out there, their bobcats tend to be less reproductively fit, and they also tend to be more susceptible to secondary causes of mortality. Out there, it's mange. So they have a lot of bobcats that die from mange that are impacted by these products. And I guess you hinted at bobcats controlling coyotes. They really don't. We actually put radio collars, GPS collars on a couple of coyotes where their numbers were high. And we looked at habitat use and interactions between coyotes and bobcats. And basically they avoided each other. They utilized different habitats. And so it would appear, they can both coexist in an area without negatively impacting one another.
So it's more the FDA than the bobcat.
Correct.
We have a question from a virtual viewer, Melissa. She said, are there populations of bobcats on other barrier islands like Sullivan's Island?
That's a good question. I would say that there are bobcats everywhere there's suitable bobcat habitat. For example, I know Folly Island has a bobcat or two. Sullivan's, I don't know in particular, but if they have enough habitat, they'll have bobcats.
And here we have one more question.
Hey, I was just wondering, this is a really riveting story. You guys have a lot of data to back it up too. And I'm wondering how receptive folks on the island have been who were the users of this kind of rodenticide for them stopping the use of it.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, when we first figured it out, honestly, it was, I'd heard of SGAs, knew what they were and knew this was an issue, but it was eye-opening for me to see it at Kiawah. And I think it was that way with our residents and even our pest control companies, and businesses, right? They didn't know the harm that they were doing. And so once we, educated them on that, we got really good buy-in from our Guardian program. I don't think I went over the numbers, but, we had 29 pest control companies sign up that work on the island not to use these products. We've got over 600 residential home sites that have signed up, and a lot of businesses, including rental agencies, which service hundreds of rental properties on the island. So we're making a difference. I wish we could have banned the use of these products when we knew they were causing a problem, but we didn't have the ability to do that. But we're seeing some positive signs here in the last couple of months. Our reproduction from our females this year was really good. It's the best we've seen in 4 years. We found 2 dens from 3 females, so 2 out of 3 successfully raised kittens this year, at least to this point. And we're seeing more sightings. Our residents are reporting bobcats more. So we've certainly reduced these products in the environment. It's going to take time for it to, these products can last a year or longer, inside a bobcat or another animal. So it's going to take time for all those impacts to go away. But I think we've certainly made things better.
We had a question from a virtual viewer that went along with that. Do you know why in 2017 we were seeing more use of the rodenticide?
It's a great question, and one I wish I could answer. And so, these SGAs have been around for a long time, 20, 30 years. There have been rats and mice on Kiawah for that time period and much, much longer. And so what I think, this is entirely a theory, what I think happened is you just saw a shift in the use of these products by pest control companies. So most of these, well, I would say that the vast majority of pest management on Kiawah, relating to rats and mice, is done by a professional pest control company. It's not done by residents themselves. In fact, technically, you can't even buy these products and apply them without a commercial pesticide applicator's license. And so they're effective, they're cheap, and they're easy for pest control companies to use, right? So I didn't touch on it, but the way these products are applied, and I'm sure you've probably seen these, they're black plastic boxes that have 2 holes in them. They're typically placed around buildings, restaurants. I'm sure there's plenty of them downtown. And so they just place a bait block in there containing the SGA. And then they'll come check it every 3 months and put more in. It's a very cheap, easy way to service a client without delving into the root of the problem or trying to minimize why the rats and mice were there in the first place. So I think it just became more prevalent in the industry. But I don't, that's my theory.
What kind of staff do you have to do all these things that you described?
So I have another biologist who works with me. So there are 2 of us. So yeah, that's the 2 of us. But we're lucky, right? I think we're probably the only town in the state of South Carolina that has 1 biologist, and we actually have 2. So, and again, and I didn't probably say this directly, but obviously without us having this research project underway, we would have never picked up on this issue, right? The only reason we know these bobcats were dying and we were able to get to them and get them to a lab to be tested is because they were wearing radio collars. So without that, we would have never found them, where they ended up dying.
We have a few more online questions. James asked, how can I know for sure the pest control company is not using SGAs?
Great question, and one that we get quite a bit. So ask them. Make them provide in writing the active ingredient of honestly all pesticides they're using on your property. You have a right to know that as a consumer, and they have a legal obligation to tell you what they're using. And I had it up there in the slide. There are basically 4 active ingredients that are SGAs. And then there's 4 or 5 others that are FGAs, or the first generation ones. But if you go to savekiawahabobcats.com, all that information is there, the names of the pesticides, so that you can easily figure out, what they're using.
I think we have one more question in person and one more virtual. Did you have a question?
This isn't pertaining to the pesticide, but recently they've talked about raccoons with distemper and rabies. And you said that the bobcats feed on raccoons. Have you had any, we just actually saw one today that was kind of questionable. And, he just didn't react like a normal raccoon, wondering if that has anything to do with the bobcats as well, along with this, the pesticide.
Sure, yeah, good question. So canine distemper is a very common disease out in the environment. It is maintained within raccoon populations. So basically what that means is, canine distemper is always present in raccoon populations across our state. And so typically every couple of years, It's typically in the winter or spring, we'll have distemper outbreaks. We'll see a lot of, and it happens on Kiawah too. We'll get a lot of dying or suffering raccoons that have canine distemper. And so it kind of flares up. And honestly, it's Mother Nature's way of controlling raccoon numbers and keeping them in check with the environment. Fortunately, it is a canine only disease, so it doesn't impact felines. So bobcats would not be impacted by canine distemper. It is very detrimental to gray foxes. Gray foxes are 100% susceptible to distemper. So if they get it, they will die. If a raccoon gets it, half of them are probably going to survive it, and then pass it on at some point down the road. He still can't get, a bobcat still can't get canine distemper.
And DB, watching virtually, asked, what is the optimal population number of bobcats to balance the deer population?
It's a great question. I mean, obviously our historic population was 30 to 35. That population was maintained for almost 20 years. Obviously, I would say that's the ideal population, but I do recognize that, we have developed more of Kiawah, and so that number is likely slightly lower. But that's one thing we really hope to figure out with this new research, is kind of do some population monitoring as well as habitat change modeling, and kind of come up with that perfect number, and then try to get there and stay there.
Thank you so much. Do we have any more questions here in our audience? Wonderful.
Thank y'all.
Thank you so much to Jim for joining us tonight and our audience. And again, thank you to our sponsors, Mary and Mason Holland and Christopher Cocker from Ameriprise Financial. And I do want to let you know about our next event. Here we go. It is on November 10th. It'll be on Shorebirds with Nolan Schillerstrom from SC Audubon. So we hope to see you flocking to the aquarium for that. I hope you enjoy your evening and have a great week. Thank you.